You used to be traveling a lot internationally.
Yeah.
Is that in the course of business for you?
Yeah.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Hi, everybody.
200,000 miles a year.
Everybody take their seats, and we'll get started. Thanks for joining us today for the fourth meeting of the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council. Today, we'll have a vote on a report on diameter vulnerabilities and risk reduction from Working Group 3. So we'll hear a readout from that group or a description of the report, and then we'll have a vote. After that, the other two working groups, the transition to NG911 and the emergency alerting working group, will have a readout on the work that they've been doing. So that will conclude the day. So thank you again for coming, and with that, I will turn it over to our chairman, Brian King.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for folks on the West Coast. If hopefully you're out there, because we have to do a roll call in a second to make sure that we've got enough folks here today for the vote for Travis, who's well prepared here. Let's start. I've got the names of the folks in the room, but let's start with the folks on the phone. If you could, try not to talk all over one another as you announce yourselves, please. But if you could just let me know if you're out there.
Gary Smith, Cherry Creek Radio Association.
Okay.
Good morning, Lisa. We'll do that again. Gary Smith, Cherry Creek Radio.
Okay, Gary, thank you.
Bob Gessner from American Cable Association.
Okay.
Good morning, Lee Thibodeau from Insight.
Morning, Lee.
Tim Walden, CenturyLink.
Hi, Tim.
Lori Flaherty, National 911 Program at DOT.
Hello.
Kevin Gage, One Media.
Dorothy Spears Dean, NASNA.
Good morning, Francisco Sanchez, Harris County.
Good afternoon, Francisco. Okay, we have quorum, Susan. Chief Folks, do you want to kick off with some remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. I want to thank all of you for your hard work and dedication to developing recommendations regarding the issues we've asked you to address. I am looking forward to today's vote, which is on the first report for CSRIC under its current charter, developed by working group number 3, Network Reliability and Security Risk Reduction. And as you know, the working group is capably chaired by Travis Russell of Oracle. Working Group 3 is comprised of industry experts and was tasked with recommending mechanisms to reduce risks to network reliability and security by examining vulnerabilities associated with the Diameter protocol. Diameter is an industry standard for connecting and authenticating subscribers on mobile networks. The report presented today provides an assessment on the risks as well as effective mitigation practices. As Diameter implementations begin, the work in this report will be important to ensure the security of our national communications infrastructure. I am also looking forward to hearing updates on the work of the transition to NG911 and emergency alerting working group. So thank you again for all of your hard work, and let's hit it. Let's go.
Okay, so without further ado, let's bring you up, Travis. We've got a clicker for you here.
Great. So I'm going to do something I don't typically do, and that's stand at a podium because I've been sitting all day long. So we have the slides up. All right, so good. So our charter here for this specific report was to look at risks, vulnerabilities around the Diameter protocol in mobile networks. And I'll talk a little bit about what Diameter is. There's an engineering joke, everybody knows what radius is. It's an acronym in telecom, but Diameter is not an acronym. It's twice the radius. I won't tell any more jokes. I'll leave it at that. I do want to thank the team. They did a great job. You know, I used to do a lot of training in my past, and as a technical trainer, one of the first things you learn is not to tell them everything that you know, because it takes forever and ever and ever, and you end up writing books. Rather, you want to tell them just what it is that you want them to know. And I congratulate the team here because they did a good job of just putting into this report the main points and the things that we needed for the FCC and industry to be able to know, rather than make this a voluminous report, which it easily could have been. So special thanks to the entire team. When we look at the diameter protocol, there's connectivity points. And so in the standards and the specifications, everything in the network gets labeled, and all of those connection points get labeled as well. And so that's what you see in this chart. And this is certainly not an exhaustive display of all of the interfaces that we see in the diameter protocol. There's actually more than some 60 or 70 interfaces the last time I counted. So far too many to illustrate here. But rather our focus was, where do we see the most vulnerability? Where do we see the most likelihood of attacks onto a 4G network? And so as we saw in CSRIC 5 Working Group 10 with SS7, the same holds true here, that those attacks are typically at the interconnection point between two networks. So in the case of diameter, to get a little bit techie, that's the S6A interface, and there's others that are outside facing. So all of our work actually was focusing on those external facing interfaces rather than the internal interfaces. When you look at what is the diameter protocol, just like SS7, I like to think of this as the SCADA network for telecommunications. SCADA being that control network and protocol for all of the utilities in telecom. All of the things that we do in a telecom network all requires a control protocol to be able to connect sessions, deliver text messages, allow you to roam freely, and still utilize the same services that you use. So this is a summation, if you will, and some of the important points here that we actually touched upon in the report. Transmission level security, so specifically it's in the specifications to use TLS or DTLS as well as IPsec. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is not effective. Because I think the first reaction a lot of folks had when we looked at security, even on the SS7 side, we can solve all of this with encryption. And the reality is, because of the nature of the attacks, encryption actually does you no good. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And also, when you look at peer discovery and configuration, we've seen plenty of examples when you look at DNS, where everything is auto-discovery. If I add a new route and a new router into the DNS network, it advertises out to the rest of the internet that it exists, and these are the routes that you can achieve through my presence. The problem with that is, as we see in DNS, it creates a lot of problems, it creates a lot of vulnerabilities, because anybody now can put in a rogue router and redirect an entire country's internet traffic. The same holds true in diameter, and so we do not recommend this peer discovery and auto configuration. We made that same statement, by the way, in Working Group 10. All of our research, we tried to focus mainly on the subject matter experts that presented. There's just a mountain of information out there around diameter and diameter security, and I think we had a pretty well-rounded group of SMEs here. I brought in Sergey from Positive Technologies. Positive Technologies is the Russian team that actually disclosed the SS7 vulnerabilities about 10 years ago. And so they've been very instrumental in this area of disclosing research around SS7 vulnerabilities, diameter vulnerabilities. So we brought in Sergey and his team to provide us with that hacker's viewpoint of what they were able to accomplish in diameter and some thoughts about where they see this going. And then we brought in Alexandre from Post Luxembourg. Alexandre is also a hacker, formerly from a hacking team in France. He has since come to the bright side and is now at Post-Luxembourg as a part of an ethical hacking team, which, by the way, is another very common trend that we're seeing amongst the service providers. And so Alexandre was able to provide us two viewpoints. One, as a hacker, actually launching penetration tests against his own network, but he also provided that operator perspective as to what they see as feasible to protect against and what they see as a long shot. Cathal McDade from Adaptive Mobile, we brought him in as a vendor. Cathal has done some research here on diameter and had some interesting insights as to what they're seeing globally through some different networks. And then, of course, Dr. Silke, she and I worked together on quite a few initiatives within GSMA, and she's been doing quite a bit of research in this area of diameter. And typically when a new vulnerability comes up, it's her and I that get called in to do an assessment and form a team. So was glad that we could get Dr. Silke in here to share some of her research. And, of course, I shared some of my research as well. So what we found with diameter, as we reported in Working Group 10, we have the same issues in diameter that we had in Working Group 10, plus some new ones. Certainly location tracking, we have that same issue in diameter because diameter performs that function in the network in place of SS7. So if you think of 3G, it's all SS7 based, 4G, it's all diameter based. So you have the same functionality, the same things that have to happen in the 4G network. Therefore, the same vulnerabilities that we saw in 3G, they apply here to 4G as well. So the call and the text interception, that is also one of the vulnerabilities within diameter. One that did not exist in SS7 was data interception. I actually had to go to a different part of the network. I had to go to a different protocol, the GPRS tunneling protocol, in order to intercept user data sessions. But with diameter, there was a bit of consolidation around some of those functions. And so now using diameter, I can actually intercept user data sessions. And of course, denial of service, that continues to be a problem and will for the foreseeable future. And when we say account fraud, we're actually talking about the ability to gain access into subscriber profiles, modify those subscriber profiles. And so, for example, if I have a prepaid account, change that to a postpaid account, or change the forwarding numbers that I might have programmed into my profile. So those were the main vulnerabilities that were presented to us by the SMEs, and therefore that was the primary focus of the report. We understand there's probably going to be others as diameter progresses. But the one thing which I didn't capture here, but the one thing that we did recognize is that unlike SS7, we haven't seen a whole lot of attacks in the wild. In fact, we've seen none. We've seen some reports that some of the vendors have been putting out that they see suspect traffic. But suspect traffic can also be a misconfiguration of a node, which 9 times out of 10, that's what it is. It's a misconfiguration of a node. So we really have not seen any real attacks on a diameter network. And the reason is that on a global basis, there are very, very few operators that are using diameter as their roaming interconnect. They're still using SS7. There are some networks that internally within their own companies, they're using diameter between their own networks, country to country. But from a roaming perspective, it's still predominantly SS7. And so we foresee that for the foreseeable future anyways, we're going to see more emphasis put on known methods and methodologies, which would be through SS7. But we are seeing some experimentation going on around diameter. In fact, one of the things that I shared with the group, we've been doing some research on where this pops up. And there are countries that actually teach diameter vulnerabilities as a part of their university curriculums. So, the expertise is growing. We're seeing a lot of attention is being placed now on the diameter networks. I think, we're probably in the same place SS7 was 4 years ago. It's going to be catching up. There is a very clear market, by the way, to attack a wireless network, and here's the reason why. We carry these, I call it a beacon, in our pockets. And you probably saw, all of the reporting around Facebook and all of the data that they've been collecting. All of that comes right out of our phones. And it's become a very rich source of personal data. Now that hackers have found a means of accessing that data, that's why we see so much attention that's being placed on 3G networks, on 4G networks. I think we'll see the same thing in 5G networks. In this first bullet here where we talk about, there's a clear market for this, what we're actually seeing is that you can go into the dark web and order services to do a text message interception. All you have to provide is a telephone number, and the company will then intercept text messages on your behalf. It costs about $200 for each text message. You can do the same thing around voice calls as well. So that's what we mean by there's a clear market, and it's commercialized. We see services, we see products. One of the other the threats that we see is around network configurations. Occasionally, especially in diameter networks, companies will bring in their IT departments to do the implementation of these core network functions because they have all of the IP expertise that you need to be able to do that. Unfortunately, they haven't got a lot of experience in dealing with critical network infrastructure. And so it's a common mistake that we see where they'll take a critical network function and attach it to a public-facing internet to make it easier for them to do remote diagnostics, remote provisioning, and so on, not understanding that they have just exposed the entire core network to the world. We see this all over the world, and I have found many instances of that happening here in the United States as well. So insecure network configurations do make attacks easier, and it does open up yet another attack vector. It's just assumed any kind of an internet-style attack, you're going to see that in diameter, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The diameter protocol itself, by the way, wasn't created from scratch. It was developed after HTTP protocol. So there's a lot of similarities between HTTP and the diameter protocol and its structure, how it works, and so on. So that concept and the fact that it was tailored after internet-type protocols already, that opens it up to other types of attacks that we would see on the internet in the wild. And it should just be assumed that any network could be accessed without authorization. Actually had this in a different session yesterday. This question came up about trust. And it's unfortunate that we have bad actors in the industry that are selling access to the roaming ecosystem at the control layer, so to diameter and to SS7, for a very small fee. As long as we have bad actors that are a part of that ecosystem, then we cannot have any trust in these network connections at all anymore. At one point we did, because every network connection was made through a technology that was inherently secure. It was the same as having a hardwired connection between networks. We don't have that anymore. Now we have IP, which is a logical connection between networks. And if I've got a bad actor that is providing access into that network and a network identifier that shows me as a trusted partner of the roaming ecosystem, then we can no longer assume anybody can be trusted because we don't know what lies beyond them. So that's another major issue. So the principal findings, number one, monitoring and analytics has never become more important for all networks, at least on incoming and outgoing traffic. And we saw this play out within SS7. When the SS7 vulnerabilities were first presented to industry back in 2013, I was actually in the room when the hackers presented that, and everybody in the room was probably about 130 operators that were in the room, and everyone was shaking their head saying, we don't have that problem. And so when we started talking about the problem, I asked, how many of you can actually show evidence that you don't have this? I mean, has anybody monitored the network, collected a month's worth of traffic? And so, of course, nobody could. We actually made it an action item to go back, pull traffic, and out of that room full of operators, only 5 operators were able to come back and actually produce 30 days worth of traffic. And they were surprised at what they saw. So I think we've gotten better there. I see a lot, especially here in North America, operators are moving very, very quickly to put monitoring and analytics into place. But remember, we all connect to this other ecosystem outside of the United States, and they're not quite there. So we still have that risk. Of course, network hygiene could never be more important, and we've got a lot of experience that we can fall back on from the IT industry. Good network hygiene in IT applies just as well into telecommunications space. There's been a lot of documentation coming out of industry. The GSMA, we created FS19, which is the guidelines for diameter security. FS21, which is, I guess we call it the fraud manual, which encompasses a whole lot of different things. And then, of course, IR88, which also had some security best practices in it, specifically for interconnecting LTE networks. And in those documents, it talks about access control. And the concept behind access control is limiting the amount of access that another network has. We've never had to do this in telecom before, and now we do. But if you think about it from an IT perspective, anytime you have somebody new coming onto the network, they never have full access to everything on the network. Think of your own companies. You'll get email, but you're not going to get access to the financials. That same principle, what is called least access privilege in the IT world, applies to telecom as well, and that's access control. And so that's what you see spelled out in the industry recommendations, this least access policy control. Mobile networks, they're extremely complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of interfaces in them. There's a lot of differences from one network to the next. There's no cookie cutter approach, if you will. Every network is different. So implementation mistakes are common, but they also create an issue as well. And so there needs to be regular testing to verify that you don't have misconfigurations in your network. It was interesting looking at some of the SME's reports when they were showing some of their findings when they were doing audits, and the majority of their findings were because of misconfigured nodes. As soon as they went back and they fixed the misconfigured node, reprovisioned it, all of that suspect traffic went away. So I mentioned a little bit about security assessments, and what that means is it's really twofold. One, doing regular audits to make sure that you've put security policies into place in as many places as possible. There is no magic box for this, by the way. I mean, you can't just put in a box and it magically goes away. It needs to be a distributed approach. And just as you'll see in IT practices, you need to distribute security across multiple nodes, multiple layers within the network. We call it the castle theory in IT, or defense in depth, if you will. And the idea is just to put as many layers of security as you can, so when a hacker breaches one wall, and they will, they still have another one that they have to breach, and then another one, and then another one. So the harder you make it, hackers are lazy. If they get too many barriers, they're going to go away, and they're going to go look for an easier network. So you want to make it as difficult as possible. As I mentioned earlier, roaming ecosystem, it continues to be the primary attack vector. I think we're going to see that for a long time to come. And like I said, I'm encouraged by all of the work here in the U.S. Operators have done a great job of shoring that up, following these recommendations. But remember, we've got other network operators that we connect into outside of the United States that aren't quite there. And so we still have to be cognizant of those, as well as some of our content providers. We've seen OTT providers that connect in that then abuse their contracts. They put access for sale out there on the dark net. So contracts is another area that needs to be addressed. This is a difficult concept to present without a whiteboard and a graph, but the way that diameter works is different than SS7. If I'm going to send a command to a database in somebody else's network, let's say I'm network A, and I want to go to network B and find out where Travis's phone is at any given time. So I will send a command, and it'll have to go to somebody else's network. So it will actually reach another router in that network, which will then have to look at that particular message and determine how to route it. When it does that, though, it's not going to look at the origination address and authenticate it. Rather, there's going to be an identifier. It's a transaction identifier, so we'll call it transaction number 1. And it's going to remember that, and it's going to remember the IP address that it received the command from. So even if I say I am Sprint telephone, it doesn't authenticate if I'm Sprint telephone. It simply has my IP address, it remembers that transaction identifier, and it sends the message on to the next hop. And at the next hop, that node's going to do the same thing. It's going to look at how it received the message. Well, it came from network Z on this IP address. So it's going to remember that IP address, it's going to remember transaction number 1, and it's going to forward the message. So it follows this hop-by-hop path. The reason why that's important is when the network answers, it's going to use that exact path to return the answer. So it's going to use the IP address that it received the request on to route the answer back. That means that I can declare that I'm anybody from my laptop and send a command into a network, and I'm never going to be authenticated, and the answer is still going to get routed to my laptop. So this spoofing is a major area that has to be looked at. We're still, as an industry, we don't have any way of defining how to fix this yet. IPsec was presented as one means for this. However, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm going to a bad actor in the roaming ecosystem, they're going to authenticate me anyways. So IPsec has no value here. Encryption has no value here. There is work going on in the industry for end-to-end encryption. There's some work going on in GSMA around an end-to-end diameter encryption scheme. The problem there is that then I'm putting everything into an envelope, and if I'm a transiting network, I have no visibility to what it is I'm transiting. So I could be passing malware and other types of bad packets from network to network with no means of identifying what it is. So this is another area that is going to require some more investigation. IoT has taken on a change as well. I mean, obviously, the biggest issue around IoT is denial of service attacks. But most IoT, for the big devices, they'll have a SIM card. So, for example, connected car. Connected car is like a giant iPhone on wheels. It's got an iPhone, it's got a SIM card, it's got an MC address. It's really just a big giant phone on wheels. But there's other devices that are being classified now that don't have SIM cards, but they still need that network connectivity to be able to communicate back to application servers. So now the industry has defined what's called a Narrowband IoT device. Put it here because Narrowband IoT devices use the diameter protocol to deliver their payload through the network to their application servers at the other end. So there is actually a function that's been defined by 3GPP. It's called the Service Capabilities Exposure Function. For 4G, it's going to just be the exposure function in 5G. That's an important element because that is there to manage any narrowband IoT connectivity, and it gives you the ability to isolate narrowband IoT traffic from the rest of the diameter network. So those were the findings. You probably want to hear about the recommendations. So, number one, we believe that FCC and the DHS need to continue engaging with us in industry around the security issues, but more importantly, to share information and threat intelligence, and that's both ways. The only way that we can make recommendations is if we see what the threats are. If we get that threat intelligence back, then we can make some actionable recommendations on how to mitigate those threats. Unfortunately, this industry on a global scale is a little reluctant to share threat intelligence. Nobody likes to report a breach in their network, for example, or how that breach happened. So we got to fix that problem, because the only way that we can really make a defensible network is if we truly understand not just what the threats are, but how these attacks are being placed, how they're manifesting themselves into the network. So we strongly encourage industry and government to work together on that. And also to continue with industry, looking at enhanced protections for VIPs and government officials. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the vehicles for doing that. I think 5G, and I'll save that detail for my 5G report because I'm going to need some subject matter there. So, but in 5G, we have this concept of network slicing, and so you have the ability there to provide an isolated communications channel, secure communications channel for VIPs, government officials. We could do the same thing in diameter just through isolation and in providing some different services there, but 5G is a better enabler for that. There are some things commercially, though, that we can do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also need to look at how to declassify threat information as it gets received and share that with industry in a quicker format. Like I said, sometimes I find that there's a vulnerability that gets manifested in someone's network, but nobody hears about it until months and months and months and months later. So the sooner we hear about these things, again, industry is very, very quick to be able to look at these things and provide recommendations on how to mitigate those threats. The sooner we know about them, the quicker that we can provide actionable items. We talked a little bit, I think, about this in the SS7 report. When we look at peer relationships, and this was actually addressed in the GSMA as well, we need to evaluate who connects to the network and for what purpose are they connecting into the network. And this goes back to, the comment I made earlier about least access privileges, making sure that you have the right filters and policies in place so that when a partner is connecting into the network, they're only accessing the bare minimum of what they are allowed to access and only allowed to send certain commands and retrieve certain information to deliver the services they're partnering with you for. So that's a very important piece. And the GSMA, again, has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, both in the guidelines for the policy control, as well as even some contract language for shoring up contracts that typically don't have any restrictions. Which is a good segue to the next recommendation, which is to follow the security and best practices of industry in the GSMA, where there's been quite a bit of work on this already, the FS19 document. And we continue to evolve that document. We're reviewing it again for a new revision coming out soon. So those are all living documents. And typically what happens, in fact, I just heard this on a phone call yesterday, a new vulnerability will come out from a hacker. They'll come into the GSMA because they're global. They'll share that research with the GSMA first in a closed environment as with the security group so that we have an opportunity to assess the threat and to provide some mitigation back to all of the community. And then, and they'll typically give us 6 months to do that before they'll then make it public at a Troopers or C3 or some of the other hacking conferences. We mentioned this one earlier, the threat intelligence and information sharing. We saw this many years ago, I think it was 93, 94, when they had the Network Reliability Council, when it was formed because of all of the SS7 failures, and there was a lot of information sharing that was being sent back and forth between operators. So we've done this, before. I think we need to resurrect a vehicle like that again, so that when we see these types of events, they can be shared in a closed environment, in a secure environment, and then industry can provide some recommendations. Continue participation. I don't want to keep pounding on GSMA because there's other organizations here, but these standards bodies, the trade associations are important. because this is where you see the technology first. There's a lot of work being done in 3GPP SA3 right now around security of 5G, but we're also looking at security for diameter because there will be diameter aspects in a 5G environment. So it's important for us to be involved in those activities. Likewise at ADIS, there's a lot of work being done within the cybersecurity community, and those become standards. And so it's important to participate. And, it's easy to just get on the call and then, just listen while you're doing paperwork. I'm guilty. But we need to be contributing, especially on a global scale. When you look at the global scale of what's happening, there's some of us in the room, but then there's this mountain of folks coming in from different regions, and they're flooding the standards bodies with contributions. So we need to be a strong voice because we're going to be dealing with these networks and the security vulnerabilities for quite a while. We talked a little bit already about encryption, but here's where encryption does provide a pretty vital role. Even if you have a very secure network, and by the way, nobody is 100% secure. Even if you have the most secure network available, you still will have instances where you may want to protect communications, especially as a VIP or if you're a government official. And so it's very important that you have the ability to do that. And there's a lot of applications that are available on the market. Personally, I use things like Signal and SureSpot and Wicker, and there's a whole list of them you can pick and choose from. I strongly recommend that VIPs, government officials especially, look into those applications. And I think this is where industry and government can help educate as to which ones are the best, and maybe even some third-party testing to verify that. Which ones are the best applications to be used in those cases, which ones are the most effective, because I think that's an important piece as well. And last but not least, assessments. Sorry, I should put that in much bolder print, in like size 15 print. I was trying to figure out what that last word was. So recommendation around security assessments as a tool. What that means is a trend that I'm seeing, especially in Europe, is for operators to begin penetration testing of their networks on a continuous basis. They've come to recognize, if you don't, the hackers are going to do it for you. There's actually a hacking group that is out scoring all of us on the internet. They give every country a score, and then they show which operators within that country has the highest and the lowest scores. They do that at no charge, just for your benefit. And for a slightly phenomenal fee, they'll tell you how they got to that conclusion. So we're starting to see this trend. And by the way, this is another IT principle, right? Continuously testing the network, doing network assessments and audits to ensure that the network is secure. It applies to telecom just as well. I don't recommend you do that on a production network because we have seen, like in Telenor, where they ended up crashing a critical element and they had a very long outage. That was one of those hackers that was testing their network at no additional charge. But you should do regular assessments on the network. And when designing networks, and you're going to see this come up actually in the standards for 5G, especially if it's a national network, using secure domains is always the best idea. Back when I was doing work with DoD, we always would take each of the theaters and treat them as completely separate and isolated domains for security purposes. It's the same concept, that we're using here. You want to make sure that you have each of your regions completely isolated so that I can't penetrate one region and I have the entire network. You want to treat each of them as their own domain, and that's what this means, the secure domain. And that concept is coming up again in the 5G standards as well, to where we implement everything in 5G in a secure domain. And last but not least, for North America, we need to investigate how we can establish a circle of trust. We talked a little bit about this trust idea earlier, and we understand that there's issues around trust, right? And because we have partners that are bad actors. But I think within North America, and the group thinks that within North America, there can be some work done to where we do create this circle of trust. And maybe it's through some joint testing and some other exercises. But I think that's an important thing to be looking at as we go forward, at least for the North American market. And with that is the end of the report.
Wow. I guess we don't do a round of applause, but I think, just thank you, Travis. Very comprehensive readout, and thank you for members of the working group. A very, very thorough analysis of diamide protocol and all the risks associated with that. I do have one question myself here before I kind of open up for everybody else, but you mentioned the forum where we could probably share best practices or known kind of indications of compromise and that kind of thing. Is there something that exists today that we could leverage, or is it's something that should be established? And I guess how can the FCC help?
So there's pockets of information sharing. So the GSMA created a mechanism last year where they created a form and asked the operators anytime they saw an incident, to fill that out, submit it. But it only gives visibility within the GSMA security group. I've seen similar. I think CTIA is also working on information sharing. But I think there needs to be something, bigger. Like we get certs today, right? And there's a tremendous amount of information available through the certs. I think we need a mechanism like that specific to telecom. The trick, though, is that we have to be careful who we share it with, because we certainly don't want to open up Pandora's box and say, oh, yeah, we got this great vulnerability. So we have to figure out a way that we can securely share that intelligence, not just among operators, but amongst the vendors as well, because vendors have a tremendous amount of expertise in solving these problems, and so and a tremendous amount of resources that can be dedicated to that as well.
Okay, thanks, Travis. So a few of us in the room here, but if you've got questions in the room, do the tent card flip if you have one. I have a question from Mary Boyd.
To your team, it was very enlightening, and I'll certainly share your report internally with the West Corporation and our network of security experts. I did note that in Section 5.2.3 about location tracking, and we probably can't disclose a lot of that information, but it is concerning that is a threat, and it's a threat within the networks. I would just ask if in 5G, if you're continuing to look at that particular threat to both our citizens and public safety, that we just look specifically what we can do to minimize that, because that is, I don't know how real that is today, but I suspect it's very real. If it wouldn't be in this report, but it's concerning because I think it has implications throughout public safety, 911.
It's actually the most prevalent attack that we see globally today is the location tracking. I mean, the good thing, if there's a silver lining there, it's not very granular, so it's not, the same information that you would get from hacking into, Pokemon Go, which has your GPS coordinates.
Right.
But it does disclose the network that is presently serving the device and the cell that's providing service to the device. And as we go to 5G and we start shrinking the size of the cell, we're talking about femtocells now.
Right.
That's where it becomes a lot more concerning. And yes, we are looking at that in 3GPP.
And I'd just also like to point out that there's now a distinction between ethical hackers. Did you define that in this report? I didn't notice that.
We just call them researchers to be politically correct.
Thank you. Good job.
Okay, any other questions in the room? It doesn't look like it. Oh,
Travis, I wanted to follow up on the question that Brian asked. And we were talking about information sharing constructs that exist today for communications. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the existing information sharing and analysis organization for comms, so the NCC, the National Coordinating Center. That might be an option for doing, what you were describing. Okay.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing what that is, and we can share it with the group for this next round. Yep.
Okay, and then for everybody who was multitasking during Travis's presentation, he was very polite with that, but if there are questions on the phone? You guys still there?
Okay.
We are.
We're alive.
Just checking.
This is Gary Smith with Cherry Creek Radio. In a couple of the former CSRIC work groups, we have addressed the need for an information sharing infrastructure that would allow information to be shared without exposing ourselves to punitive measures by the FCC. And at that time, Admiral Simpson had made it clear that in the EAS world, if stations did not protect themselves adequately, that they could be, that the Commission would exercise its responsibility to penalize those stations or even withdraw licenses. Now, this is on a smaller scale than we're talking about here, but still, there is a need for a secure information sharing structure that will not open up somebody that has a weakness that they're trying to correct to punitive measures, so that they can feel comfortable that they can resolve the problems effectively without getting into trouble because they divulged them. And within the broadcast industry, there were major players that just said, we're not going to do that because we don't trust the vehicle that's out there. So I would be very interested in seeing what can be done.
Yeah, I definitely think that's something. Thanks for that. I think there's obviously something we've all got to take away and ponder what the best mechanism for this would be to securely share that level of information within the industry. So, great comment. Any further questions out there? All right. Well, with that, we can. I guess we move to a vote. Yes, from a protocol point of view, we'll just, if we agree with the recommendations from the working group, let's all say aye. Go ahead, Don. Okay, so, okay, let's say aye if we agree.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, any nays out there? Okay, it's approved. Thank you, Travis. Great work. So next up, we've got a Working Group 1 update from Mary Boyd from West Safety. Uh-huh.
Go to the podium, I guess, and make that easier. But you're gonna don't leave me out here, Bud. It was good, really good.
Good afternoon, everyone, council members, members on the phone. Thank you for the opportunity to give this update on Working Group 1. We are all things 911. I'd also like to thank the Commission for extending our deliverables for Task 1 to June and Task 2 to September, October timeframe for that council meeting. Okay, there it is. I'm going to try to use this technology and see what I can do with it. Am I pointing up? Got it. Okay. So just to recap for everyone and those on the phone, our objective for Working Group 1 is really to look at improving of the transition from legacy 911 to NG 911. Looking at the specifics within those networks and making that transition so that we can enhance the reliability and the effectiveness of that transition into NG 911. And we're also focused on small carriers. I think, as you guys all know, we have a full complement now of both our members and our alternates, and I want to thank Jeff and Suzanne for helping us this quarter finalize those alternates. I won't go through all the names, but I can tell you we're very well represented now across the industry, and I feel like we have a very good full complement of expertise. I do want to draw out for your information, we do have some membership changes since our last report, and I just want to give recognition to these individuals. Terry Reese from Erickson has joined us as an official member. We have a couple of replacements within Working Group 1. Trey Fogarty left, Nina and Dan Henry. Dan, welcome. Welcome to our first CSRIC initiative. He kind of has hit the ground running and joined representing Nina. So I think you're probably drinking out of a fire hose on both of our tasks right now, but we're glad you're there. Roger Hickson is also the official alternate for Nina. Roger has been in this business a very long time, very well informed on networks, and we're glad to have his assistance. We have alternates Hallie Frazee for Francisco Sanchez with Harris County, Patrick Donovan for Matt Gerst, Jay English with ABCO for Holly, and then Bob Sherry alternate for my position. And then we've also replaced Tim May, David Firth. We're delighted to have you involved and spend your week with us. Every week, David, between now until every week until we're finished. So, as you all know, we're broken into two tasks. And Budge, where are you? Are you behind me? Budge Courier co-leads the Task 1 effort, which is really focused on the technical aspects within the networks and that transition. He co-chairs with Walt Magnuson, and I'm going to start sharing the wealth with these guys who work so hard every week. So, Budge, I'm going to turn over Task 1 to you so you can give your updates.
Thank you, Mary. All right, so as Mary said, the working group we broke Task 1 into two tasks, Task 1, Task 2. I'm primarily focusing on Task 1. So what we've started with was the assignment we were given by the Commission to look at the existing best practices and then develop guidance regarding the overall monitoring, reliability, notifications, and accountability for 911 outages in this transitional NG 911 environment. So what we did with this task is we started to identify some of these transitional 911 elements. And so to do that, we sort of needed a baseline technical document so that we could do some comparisons between today's legacy environment and this next-gen transition that we're going to. Understanding that each person or state or entity that does this transition is going to do it slightly differently. I'm in California. We have a slightly different approach than some other states do. And so these transitional elements were really important to understand and document. So the technical baseline document has been developed. We've reviewed it for the past several weeks, 2-hour sessions every Monday to go through the document. And we are through that portion, and we had to have this baseline to then start to identify the different elements and really the demarc points in the network that introduce some of the challenges when you're handing this traffic off from either coming in on the aggregation side or coming in from a legacy environment and then taking that traffic and passing it over to someone who's providing NG core services and then delivering that call all the way to the PSAP and the call processing equipment that would be there at the PSAP. And there's multiple demarcs throughout that entire evolution, especially depending on how you've handled the transition and what transitional elements you've got in place. And those transitional elements could exist anywhere in the network, whether it's coming in aggregation, if you have to transition legacy CAMA SS7 traffic over into a SIP type delivery, or all the way over on the CPE side where you may have to again transition over to some type of CAMA trunk in order to deliver to that call answering equipment. So that effort has been completed. The next steps that we're going to be working on is to really do some research on the detection capabilities that are out there, the outage reporting, procedures that exist today, try and research some of that existing capabilities that are out there so we can make sure that when we look at best practices, we already identify some of the work that's being done, either from those that are providing aggregation services or the carriers themselves, originating service providers, or even some that are doing some of this work in the NG911 space. So that's the next step that we're working on. So when we come back and report out next time, we'll have that piece finished as well. We're quickly coming to the end, as you know. So this slide here really just talks about what I just provided a summary of. We're researching some of the best practices. We're going to be complete. That work began to look at what we currently have the capability of doing now, and that we completed that in January. As I said, that baseline document we'll have completed by the end of this month, and then we're going to start looking at some of the transitional risks and the disruptions to the network. We'll be finishing that up in April. This research of existing monitoring and reporting capabilities that are out there, that'll be completed in April as well. And then we need to get a draft of the best practices regarding some of these overall monitoring, reliability, notification, and accountability, and we'll have that completed in April. Our final report will be due in May, so we have enough time to provide comments and feedback in order to have the thing wrapped up in June. So that's where we're at today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on Task 1 you may have before we turn it over to Mary talking about Task 2.
Okay, thanks, Budge. I don't see any questions in the room here. Any questions on the phone?
Thank you, Budge.
Thanks, Budge.
I'd also like to just take a moment, if it's okay. I'd like to recognize we have probably one of our youngest volunteers in the room. Miss Violet Courier is here with her dad, and she's already tested him for his knowledge before his presentation, so good job there. That's our future, so I'm glad you're here. So on to Task 2. This effort is co-led by Dorothy Spears Dean from the Commonwealth of Virginia and Jim Gerke from the Texas 911 Alliance. Both are represented on the phone today, but just due to the challenges and dynamics of reports over the conference bridge, they voted me in for giving their presentation this morning. So guys, if I don't do you justice for the Task 2 efforts, please do something. Speak up, add whatever. So Task 2, as I indicated earlier, is really about making recommendations to CSRIC related to small carriers, rural carriers, for best practices for managing the transition from a legacy 911 perspective to an NG 911. Many of these companies and carriers have not been in the network evolution effort specific to 911 for a very long time. So I've said before, I think this one has a very appropriate place in our country as we begin to make this major change into IP and to NG 911. In Task 2, we're supposed to provide advice to the small carriers so that they can effectively deliver their traffic. Task 2 will look at any economic disadvantages that may hinder this transition. Do they have any barriers to implementation? We have a lot of experts on this team looking at the networks and looking at the process that will be able to identify if there are barriers in making the transition. And then probably one of the most effective tools that we believe will help small rural carriers will be the Readiness Checklist. And that follows the concept we set forth during the TFOPA initiative. So the team is fully engaged. Today, as in Task Group 1, Task Group 2 meets on a weekly, bi-weekly, couple of hours, lots of work being done behind the scenes. And today we have contributions in that are being reviewed. They have completed the draft language on interconnection as well as looking at security. And Travis, thank you for some of your help with our email. We appreciate your help on that. They're going to be focused on state issues and interconnection issues next, and then the small carrier checklist. So They are well underway. I know the co-leads would very much like to have the draft completed before August. I'm optimistic with this team. They may get there. They've got a pretty good tailwind on their efforts. We have talked to David Firth about the small rural carriers and a process for making sure we fully vet with the that environment, their proposals, and so I think they'll get their work done early so we can get that process completed. This slide is just a recap of our schedule. Task 1 is budget indicated. Will be before you in June, asking for consideration of that report. They are two separate reports that will be issued. They do complement one another, may repeat a little bit of information in the two reports, but they're being kept separate and apart. And then, guys, did I just give us a whole new schedule for September? Was it September or October is September? Well, I was optimistic we were going to get an October deadline, so
nice try. Well, that's one way to get it.
It was nice, and let the record reflect that I have erred, and that whole team that reviewed this PowerPoint presentation obviously missed it as well. You guys are in the doghouse, but we will have the report to you by September. And then just our next steps as we do continue the drafting. Evaluation. We're in the process, as Budge said, of collecting the data from our stakeholders about the tools they use today in network monitoring, detection. That is really on one of our top priorities to get that data in from our stakeholders as we do this research. Our work group members have provided that, and we're getting good response to it. We will continue on in our weekly and biweekly task group meetings, and if any of y'all want to jump in and participate, we welcome all volunteers. All right, and that's a quick wrap, Mr. Chair, of our updates for Working Group 1. Any questions? Jim or Dorothy, did I leave anything out for Task 2? Okay.
No, we did find out why they wanted you to present it, though, with the dates in there. So I think that was the setup.
That was the setup. Yes, it was. All right, council members, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, team. Okay, last but not least, we have Farouk.
Thank you very much. So this is a report of Working Group 2 on comprehensive reimagining of emergency alert. And I think this time, last time I was the only one on the podium and everyone, so I'm glad everyone is going to get a chance to stand up and, stretch the legs.
You set the bar.
Was it a low bar or a high bar?
Last time you left us with a cliffhanger, so we're anxious to find out what the answer was.
You're going to have to wait for the cliffhanger. So what is Working Group 2 all about? We are looking at emergency alerting and how to potentially reimagining. And by emergency alerting, I mean all types of alerting, whether it's ATSC 3.0, VIA, EAS, 5G. So we are putting everything on the table, and we are trying to find out what is the best way going forward on emergency alerting. So that's one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is there's a theme today is on the security aspects. And security aspects obviously is very important on all levels. We heard about it in Working Group 3, Working Group 1, and obviously Working Group 2 has the security elements that we will have to evaluate on the emergency alerting. And we have two reports, one in June and one in December. So this is the list of contributors, and I really want to, I think this is a theme from the other working group members. Really want to appreciate and thank all the members. Without them, we really couldn't do any work progress. We just lost our most valuable player. Of course, yeah. They have more important stuff. Yeah. So these are the members of our group, and they are very valuable, and they have been providing excellent contribution to the group, and I really appreciate the effort that you're putting into the work. In a way of background, it's needless to say it's critical to send relevant emergency information in timely fashion to the targeted audience in the affected area. There are a number of techniques available to do so. And what we are looking at is to find what are evaluate the existing technologies and find what are the potential enhancement improvements we can make, or even new approaches. We have everything on the table at this time. So what is our, the first thing I want to point out is this big picture view of the public alert system. You can see that there are many elements to it and many players to it. If you look at the top part, the different facets, it starts from alerting, triggering, the composition aspect, dissemination, presentation, and integration. And there are so many different parts. We often talk about the technology, which is the lower level, but there is beyond technology. There are also procedures that we need to talk about, human factors, and policy and organization. So we have a really big picture to consider. For the purpose of our discussion, we are really going to primarily focus on the last three columns, mostly because of the limitation of the time that we have and the composition of the group. But I should point out that there are other groups, for example, FEMA-NAC, that's really focusing on the first two columns. And my hope is, as time goes on, we have a lot more communication between the groups to make sure that we have an end-to-end perspective of the system without any barriers. So what's our approach? Our approach is very simple. We've started with landscaping the existing dissemination technology, where it's 5G, EAS, ATSC 2.0, VIA. Then this is very important. This is something that we have been working on very closely for the last months or so. Look at the use cases, and these are use cases independent of any existing dissemination technology. Forget about whether we have VIA or 5G. What is it that the public safety would like to have in their bags if they had any wish list? So come up with the use cases that would say, hey, this is a scenario that I would like to make sure that the public safety is safe. And that's, how do we address that? And a special focus we are putting on things like, for example, deaf and hard of hearing, visually impaired, and special needs. Because, we want to make sure that emergency alerting applies to everyone. And then based on that, we will do an analysis on the non-technical aspect of emergency alerting, for example, also policy, procedures, and human factors, as I described earlier. And combining the two sides of the equation, then we can propose some recommendation on how we can reimagine emergency alerting in near term, as well as things like, we know that we may not be able to do these things in 5 years, but here's an objective, aspirational objective that maybe we want to do 10 years plus now, 5 to 10 years plus now. So we want to provide some of that guideline as we're in the long term, if possible. So to do that, what's the status of our group right now? We are meeting every other week, and it's very interactive, very good meetings going on. We have completed the landscaping effort. We have looked at the emergency alerting, EAS, ATSC, PBS, 5G, VIA, CAP, etc. And now we are in a process of developing this analyzing these use cases to make sure that we distill some requirements and recommendations from those. We are meeting bi-weekly right now. I think we are fine with bi-weekly, but as we get closer and we get into the panic mode, we may go to weekly. Warning. But I think we should be fine because, we have a report drafted, and the report is like over 50 pages already, and I think that's just halfway through. So we have a lot of work we are doing, so we're going to continue doing that work, but we know that we have a deadline coming up in June to provide that report, and we are working towards that goal. So what are the next steps? We are working on the use cases. We're going to complete that. Then leverage the use cases to distill needs and recommendations from those. and identify and recommend objectives on how to reimagine the end-to-end emergency alerting, and continue our bi-weekly calls and provide reports as needed to this group. With that said, I would like to see if there are any comments, questions.
Okay, same protocol. Any questions in the room? I think Violet had a question, but that'll have to wait until the next meeting. That's your cliffhanger.
Yeah, I know.
Any questions out there on the phone? So June, quite a deadline building for us in June there.
Yes.
Okay, so
Should be a busy time.
busy meeting in
Feel
June.
free to call me at 3 a.m. When you're having a
Yeah, I
panic
mean,
attack.
you have to tell the story, but
I just have panic attacks over CSRIC every night around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Yes, Suzanne, I dream of y'all often.
So around May, 2 a.m. calls.
Okay. Any other questions out there? Okay. Thanks, Farouk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Really, thank you, Mary. Thank Farouk, Travis, for great work, and thank you to the rest of the council members for your input, especially into the recommendations on Working Group 3. Really great to see that coming together, and great to see that our next meeting in June we'll have some other things to vote on here. So thank you everybody for participation. So with that, unless you have anything to add, I'll hand over to Jeff.
Okay. Thanks, Brian, and thank you all again, and thanks for the work, Travis and Mary and Farouk. I assume that one of the reasons that Budge and Violet made a special trip out was hoping to see a cherry blossom or two. And I'm told, although I haven't witnessed it myself, I'm told that there's none to be seen yet. So if you all are here and you can stick around a little while longer, you'll probably see one soon. They're guaranteed to come out at some point. They're usually out by now. But thanks for coming. Everybody have a safe trip home. We'll see you here on June 29th. That's a Friday. And in the meantime, good luck with your work.
Thanks, everyone.